Hi, my name is Robert Briscoe. This is my presentation on private placement, due diligence, term sheets, and regulations. So basically the first thing is private placement offering. This is going to be the same thing as an IPO, just for a private firm. So it's sold to a much smaller group as opposed to being available to all individuals. The regulations are mostly regarding who are the individuals that you're allowed to sell to. This is basically just kind of accredited investors. I'll go over that later. So the advantages associated with private placement offerings is that they save time and money because they don't have to register with the SEC. And then if they're releasing debt notes, then they don't have to get a credit rating on those bonds. So that's going to save a lot of time and a lot of money. Also, they're allowed to offer more complex securities because the people they're dealing with are financially savvy. They understand the risks that they're taking on, so they can be a lot more complicated. They also don't have to do any annual reports, which is super nice. Frees up them a lot for business purposes. Disadvantages associated with it, basically just going to be that investments require a much higher rate of return because they're taking on a larger amount of risk. All the investors have to take the total economic risk because there's no other stocks that can be used to kind of mitigate that. And so it's going to be more difficult for investors to purchase bonds as well because there's no specific rating, so they have to use collateral for every different bond that they want to buy. And then also they're going to require things like voting rights and kind of like board decisions to be bought in. So the components of a private placement memorandum, which is essentially the prospectus of a IPO, but this is the private version of it. It's going to have basically 5 major components. The first one, summary of offering terms, is basically just what's the type of security and then like price per share. Risk factors is the most important part. It's basically just going to cover all the risks associated with it. You have to be very careful about not understating these risks because you can be held liable if you accidentally omit or misstate some of these risks. Then you also have the estimated use of proceedings, which is just going to be an itemized list of where you think all the money you're gaining from this sale is going to go to. For the most part, it's an estimate, except for things like compensation. You know exactly how much people are going to be paid off these sales, and so you have to be very exact with that. Finally, you have the description of securities and business management sections. Description of securities is just going to say what's the type of security this is, what rights are associated with it. Business and management section is going to just talk about the business plan and then the managers, like what kind of experience they have. It's kind of their chance to mitigate the risk factors, but again, they don't want to overstate how strong the company is, so they have to be very careful. The drafting process for a PPM is just going to be, they need to review those documents. The lawyers are going to have an information request memorandum, which they get the financial statements and the bios on all the managers, things like that. Then they're going to make major decisions, like what's the price going to be, what's the type of share going to be. Then they prepare those documents and do all necessary filings for the SEC and the state. So basically the regulations are mostly coming from Form D of the 1933 Securities Act. And basically for PPOs, it's going to be, they can only sell to accredited investors that have a net worth of $1 million or $200,000 per year for individual and $300,000 per year for a couple. Also, they're going to see they can sell up to 1 million to any number of investors and up to 5 million to any number of accredited investors. The Jobs Act is really new. It came out in 2013, and it allows them to essentially advertise to individuals, something they were never allowed to do. For PPMs, the major thing is going to be you don't want to omit or misstate anything because you can get charged up to $5 million and 20 years in prison. Term sheet is basically just going to be that first step in the transaction process. It just outlines the provisions that some of them protect the company and some of them protect the investors. Most of them aren't legally binding. They just have confidentiality agreements and then a no-shop policy, which means they can't be looking at a bunch of different investors at the same time. The basic provisions are going to be things like the type of security offered, the capitalization and the valuation, which determines price per share, liquidation preference, what to do if things go wrong, conversion, what happens if the company decides to go public, and then preemptive rights, what happens when they decide to release more shares. The other provisions they have, earn-out provision, is just what happens when the company ends up doing really well, and the conditions precedent is just everything that's needed before they're going to finalize the sale. That's where due diligence comes in. So due diligence is the only thing that's voluntary that we've covered. It's still very much recommended. It's a thorough investigation of the company that you're looking to invest in. It's definitely different for public and private. So this is my steps for the private side. First, you want to look at capitalization of the company. Then you want to look at revenue, profit, and margin trends. You want to look at the competitors. You really need to understand what your company does and what your competitors do. Then you're going to look at valuation multiples to determine how you're priced, essentially. Management and share ownership. You want to see, are my managers worth investing in, and do they invest in their own company? The balance sheet exam just gives you a chance to look, are they really financially sound? Super nice. Expectations, essentially you're just going to be looking at where are the industry trends and where is this firm going in the future. Finally, you want to look at those risks. That should be the last thing you do, because it's very important that that's fresh on your mind when you decide on that investment decision. And that's it. Thank you.